Flashcards can teach you to write Chinese characters, but they can be boring and hide problems. Communicative handwriting is more engaging and prepares you for real-world tasks. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about handwriting. For most students, writing Chinese characters by hand mainly involves proving that you can write them or testing if you can write them, usually through flashcards, dictation tests, and the like. This is a bit odd if we compare with other language skills. We don't expect people to develop good speaking, listening, or reading simply by using drills or flashcards. Yet, when it comes to handwriting, using drills and flashcards is often the only thing that students do. And I'm not an exception here. I think I learned to write about 1,500 characters by hand before I ever used a single Chinese character to communicate something interesting or important. Naturally, the reason people rely so much on flashcards and spaced repetition is because that these methods are extremely efficient for remembering how to write Chinese characters by hand. This is something we have discussed on the podcast before, and as usual I will put links in the show notes, primarily to episodes about why flashcards can be good for learning Chinese, and Chinese characters specifically, and also about spaced repetition software. One of the main downsides is that these tools can make handwriting into a chore. If the only goal you have when writing by hand is to recall how to write characters, this is a bit circular. You're essentially practicing in order to practice. Using handwritten Chinese to record or communicate something meaningful, on the other hand, gives the skill a purpose beyond writing itself. If you want to be able to write Chinese characters by hand, flashcards and spaced repetition are very valuable tools, but I also think that you should practice handwriting Chinese with a purpose beyond the writing itself. And this is what I call communicative handwriting, and this is what we will talk about in this episode. So my definition of communicative handwriting is that it's about writing Chinese characters by hand mainly to convey information. The writing does not to be advanced or long or anything like that, but the purpose is to convey information of some kind. This is of course similar to other forms of communicative activities when learning a language. So if you speak with a friend in order to tell them something interesting, that is communicative. But if you read a dialogue aloud, or if you use the Chinese that you've learned to tell your friend what you did over the weekend, even though they already know the answer, this is not communicative. It goes without saying then that spaced repetition and flashcards obviously aren't communicative. If you have a flashcard that asks you how to write the characters for Apple, and you do that, you are not trying to convey information to anybody. You're just verifying that you know how to write these characters. Compare this with writing the same word on a shopping list. Now you are actually conveying meaning, not to another person, unless it's another person who's going to do the grocery shopping, but it could equally well be to yourself. So when you read that list, you know that you're supposed to buy apples because you wrote it on the list. It might be more natural to communicate with other people, but in this digital age where everybody types and everything is done on computers and smartphones, handwriting messages in Chinese can both be a bit weird and also highly impractical. To understand the role of communicative handwriting, it's important to understand why you are learning to write characters by hand in the first place. For example, if your main goal with writing characters is to be able to fill out forms and give your address occasionally when needed, you perhaps don't need to be able to write much at all. You can just use a dictionary and look up how to write characters when you need them. If, on the other hand, you want to or need to be able to write longer text by hand, you will benefit enormously from communicative handwriting. And you should be sure you practice this kind of writing, not just relying on flashcards. So what you do here depends on what you want to be able to use Chinese for. And don't let other people decide what you want to use Chinese for. I mean, sometimes you might not have a choice, so even if you don't care about handwriting and you're enrolled in a program that requires handwriting, well, then you might not be able to choose to ignore handwriting. But in general, try to think about what you want to do and make decisions based on that. There are many different reasons to learn to write by hand, and only some of them are about what makes sense from a cost-benefit perspective. And I explore this much more in an article called 16 Reasons to Learn to Write Chinese Characters by Hand, and I will put the link in the show notes. Still, before we continue, I want to mention that I think you should at least have one good reason to write by hand before you invest a lot of time into learning how to do so. There is, after all, no compelling reason to do so if your goal is to function in society, because you can almost always type, or when you do have to write by hand, if you happen to live in China and want to do something that requires you filling out a form, you will be able to look characters up. So there are a few downsides of relying too much on flashcards, which will practice isolated characters and words. As mentioned earlier, communicative handwriting is not meant as a substitute for deliberate character study, and that includes flashcards and spaced repetition software, but it is meant as a complement. Spaced repetition software and flashcards are very good for reinforcing how to write specific characters, but writing text is about more than that. For example, you need to know which character to write, not just how to write the character. If we look at a very simple example, there are 3 particles in Chinese, all pronounced de. If you only type your sentences, your input method will be able to choose the right one almost all the time, but if you write by hand, you suddenly have to think about which of these characters you are going to write, not just how to write each individual character. And that was just an example, but there are many cases where it's not obvious which character you should write, even if you know how to write all the characters by hand. Another issue is fluency, and we all know what fluency means when it comes to speaking, but there is such a thing as fluency for handwriting too, it's just usually less important. When we speak Chinese, it's very obvious when we pause, and if our output is too disconnected, it will be hard to understand, and nobody will call us fluent. When writing characters by hand, people rarely look at what we write as we write it, as is the case with speaking, but fluency still matters. Pausing to recall how to write a rare character occasionally, or even use a dictionary to look up how to write it, is usually not a problem, but if you do this too much, handwriting becomes prohibitively time-consuming. As a somewhat extreme example, when I was in graduate school in Taiwan, we had 3-hour in-class exams where all the answers were written by hand, usually without a dictionary. The point, though, is that having access to a dictionary here wouldn't have helped much. Yes, it might have helped us write the correct character in a few cases, but the point here was to communicate your knowledge, what you had learned about Chinese teaching pedagogy or Chinese linguistics, and to be able to do that in 3 hours, you couldn't spend half the time with your nose in a dictionary, because then there would be too little time to actually write your answers. In other words, when you write Chinese by hand in the real world, it's not only about if you can recall a character, but also how fast you can do so. Of course, it's not equally important to remember all characters quickly. Like I said, it's perfectly fine to stop and think about how to write a rare character or even look it up. But if you have to do that for all characters, you have a problem. So in essence, if it takes you as long to write wo, I or me, which is in the top 10 frequency range, as it takes you to write the character fen to order, which is in the 2000 to 2010 range, you have a problem. To summarize, spaced repetition software and communicative handwriting help you retrieve characters, but for a different purpose, and they also cover different use cases. And this is why they work so well together. So let's talk a little bit more about how to practice communicative handwriting. The main difference here is that the focus is on meaning rather than form. So we're more interested in if the characters can convey the information you want them to convey, rather than if you just wrote them correctly. When we do other types of meaning-focused practice, such as when speaking, it's important to use mostly language that you already know, because otherwise the focus will be on the language you didn't know, on the new words and grammar you needed to use, so it doesn't really count as meaning-focused. The same is true for communicative handwriting, but to a lesser extent. Looking up characters you don't know is fine, and I don't think there's a fixed percentage of characters you have to know already before it counts as being communicative, as long as you feel that the main task is conveying some kind of information, rather than just practicing characters. A useful principle might be that if you're looking up characters you actually know how to type and read, and you just want to look up how to write them by hand, this might still count as communicative handwriting, whereas if you're looking up entirely new characters and words, the focus is now on the language, not on the meaning. So what should you write, and to whom? As mentioned earlier, there are some cases where communicative handwriting will be a natural part of life, but they are rather few, and if you don't live in a Chinese-speaking environment, they are likely to be non-existent. Naturally, you can still create such opportunities. Instead of writing a message about the book you borrowed from a friend, you can write a handwritten note and put it in the book, and things like that, but this is rather limited. Another option I mentioned earlier is to write to your future self, which could include shopping lists, notes, diary entries, reminders, and so on. Another option is to do digital handwriting. So you essentially take any writing task that you would normally have completed relying only on typing, and you convert it, or part of it, to handwriting instead. So let's say you're going to write an email or a chat message, and normally you would of course just type this, but instead you use the handwriting input on your phone. On most phones this is available if you have Chinese support enabled in the first place. Simply choose handwriting as the input method and you will be able to write on screen. The result will of course be a digital text that will hopefully look identical to a text you might have typed, but now you practiced handwriting by writing it as well. If you haven't done this a lot, you will realize that it takes quite a lot of time compared to typing, and so my recommendation is to set a time limit. Maybe you write the first 5 minutes by hand and then you switch to typing. This method is very good because it allows you to interact normally with people digitally while still practicing communicative handwriting. It's time to wrap up this episode and conclude by saying that spaced repetition software and communicative handwriting are both necessary if you want to be good at writing Chinese characters by hand. Communicative handwriting is useful because it's much less boring than just doing flashcards, and it also helps you discover some problems that flashcards might hide. It's also much closer to real-world handwriting and will therefore prepare you better for real-world tasks. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.